Alrighty, so these are the notes for genetic technologies. For artificial selection, you need to know that this is when humans will pick a trait to breed for on purpose. So for example, if you look at the corn picture over on the right, it starts off as that really weedy looking thing. And at some point, a human looked at that and they picked like the fattest, nicest version of it. And then they started breeding that one. They would scatter the seeds around so the better ones would grow. And then they took the best of those, grew more of those, so on and so forth until we get modern looking corn today. Same thing with chickens. You start off with chickens being somewhat small. You pick the fattest chickens, keep breeding those until you get really fat chickens that we have today. So organisms are bred for the traits that they or that humans want them to have. And so that is how they evolve over time. And these traits don't necessarily benefit the organism itself. It benefits whoever is selecting the trait, aka us. Another really good example of this is different dog breeds. We have bred a bunch of different dogs over the years, ones that are good at running, ones that are good at swimming, ones that are good at hunting, whatever thing you would need a specific type of dog for. That's how we've gotten so many different dog breeds. Now, the opposite of artificial selection is natural selection. And you'll remember we talked about this with evolution. Natural selection is controlled by nature, and it's controlled by how adaptable you are. So for example, with the giraffes, if you happen to be born with a short neck, you are not going to survive to pass on your genes because you cannot reach leaves enough to eat, you'll starve and die, blah, blah, blah. However, your friend who was born with a tall neck, he will be able to pass on his genes to his offspring because he had a long enough neck to survive and eat. Now, that's no one's fault. Part of it is random chance, what variations you happen to be born with, and it's just how nature works. No one is behind the scenes picking out which traits are most beneficial in the situation. It is just how nature works. So artificial selection is human controlled. Natural selection is just controlled by nature and random chance. Now with genetic engineering, this has to do with things that you can't just get from simply breeding two things together. For example, the tomatoes that have the gene from a fish in them, you cannot take a fish and breed it with a tomato. That does not science. However, you can use genetic technology to take a gene from a fish who will not freeze in really cold water and genetically engineer it into a tomato so the tomato will not freeze in very cold conditions. Now, this can be controversial depending on your opinion, and there's a lot of different opinions out there. There's a lot of different types and purposes for genetic engineering, so there's a bunch of different opinions as well. Anything that has been genetically modified with foreign DNA or has had its DNA messed with in an artificial way is called a GMO, or a genetically modified organism. Most of the food you eat is genetically modified. We have genetically modified animals, and we have the capabilities and technically do genetically modify humans in some cases as well. One of those instances is called gene therapy. This is genetic engineering that is specifically used to prevent a human from being born with an illness that is genetically related. So, for example, sickle cell anemia, anything like that. The scientists will go into the embryo, take out what is bad, put in what is good, and then fix the problem. Pregnant women nowadays can often get their embryos tested to see if they have any genetic illnesses, to see if it can be fixed, or just to prepare in advance for those illnesses. Cloning is another example of genetic engineering. This is when an exact identical copy of an organism that is already existing is made. One example is Dolly the sheep. DNA was taken from this sheep named Dolly. It was cloned. They made a little embryo out of it, and then they put that embryo in another sheep, and the identical twin was born and survived. Now, go away. In order for it to count as being a clone, the DNA has to be exactly identical, and the embryo that is developed has to be put in the same species. So you couldn't try to clone a sheep and put the little clone sheep embryo into a pig. That wouldn't count. It has to be the same exact species. The bananas you eat are also clones. Bananas are almost identical in every single one that you ever eat, which is bad because if one disease affects one banana, then all the bananas are pretty much toast. So keep that in mind the next time you eat a banana. We technically can clone humans, and some human clones do happen naturally if you happen to be pregnant with twins. However, there is genetic controversy about whether or not that is ethical as well. The reason we know so much about genetics with humans as of now is partially because of the Human Genome Project. Essentially, this project listed out every single letter in all of your DNA, all the millions of pairs. So somewhere out in there in the world, there is a big piece of paper with every single letter that is in an average human's body. And this helps us to understand genetic diseases more, mutations, what genes code for what things, all that stuff. Now, there are a lot of controversies with DNA use. Some of it can be good, some of it can be bad, and this is a big list of the pros and cons. One good thing is that we can use it to cure illnesses. One thing that might not be so good is the whole concept of designer babies. Is it ethical to make your baby have blue eyes or green eyes instead of brown eyes? Is it genetically ethical to make a kid smarter than they're supposed to be? You can go down the rabbit hole with that. But there does need to be some sort of a line we draw with how much it is ethical to alter the DNA of a person or an animal. With the food that we eat, some people are comfortable with the fact that their food is genetically modified, others are not. And for some people, it depends on the organism itself. For example, there is a type of corn called Roundup Ready corn that is sprayed directly with pesticide that would normally kill it. However, it's genetically engineered to not die because of that. And some people are uncomfortable with the thought of eating food that has been sprayed directly with pesticide. Another good example would be this thing called golden rice. It's rice that has been genetically engineered to have extra vitamins and minerals in it. So even if that is all you have to eat and you live in a really poor or impoverished country, you will not starve to death or be malnourished because your rice has extra vitamins and minerals in it. So that could be an example of a good one.